Hi, how's it going? It's Rain, and at the risk of sounding like the most milquetoast gamer ever, Dark Souls means a lot to me. I'm not going to do the whole song and dance about how it saved me from the throes of depression, because you've almost certainly heard that hundreds of times before. But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't always wanted to approach the series in some way, simply because it was one of the very first that I really got into. From running through the Undead Asylum over and over again at my cousin's house as a kid, to rediscovering my love for the games later on and consuming so much knowledge of the world that I became something of a From Software compendium, it's always had a prominent place in my heart. And I know for a fact that I'm not the only one. These games seriously evoke something in people. The experience makes them passionate, prideful, and highly opinionated, which has led to the debate of deciding on the greatest of the bunch being incredibly divisive to this day. The general consensus really can't make up its mind, and you'll find vastly different takes pretty much everywhere you go. So, in an effort to resolve the discourse, which is inevitably only going to add to it, I thought I'd try taking a stab at comparing the foundational PvE aspects of each game as objectively as I can, to give you an answer that might just seem a little more conclusive than others you've encountered. But how, I hear you asking, are we going to achieve that? Well, luckily for us, I've devised a super simple scoring system. It's out of 5. And each game will be allocated points based on how I perceive the quality of the aspect we're discussing, with those being mechanics, balance, visuals, story, world, areas, systems, and bosses. 8 in total, with 5 potential points for each, means that a truly perfect entry in the series would be able to attain a maximum of 40 points. But with one of the most prominent reasons this discourse has had such longevity being that all of the games are far from it, things may end up unfolding much differently than you expect. So, with the preliminary necessities out of the way, please, if you'd like, join me as we delve once again into the forlorn kingdoms of Broken Worlds, Lordran, Drangleic, Lothric, and beyond, to answer the timeless question of which Dark Souls entry truly has the potential to outdo them all. And where better to start than with mechanics, the factor that determines exactly how you can interact with the world, and how the world, in turn, can interact with you. From broader features like how you attack and dodge, to more intricate details like the implications of your movement capabilities, these are the most foundational functions which impact what is really the most important aspect of each game, the feel. Which is something that Dark Souls 1, despite being a well-regarded masterpiece in a myriad of respects, is not particularly known for. It's honestly pretty rigid, with a lot of the animations for both attacking and evading feeling borderline turn-based in how blatantly laborious each action you take is. And while the game itself is of course designed around this, with enemies generally being slower than the sequels to make up for it, the pace of the game is resultantly quite methodical, with the tankier controls requiring that each action you take be deliberate relative to the restrictions of the game, far more so than taking an action which feels as natural as possible to the player, which in an ideal world should be a closer balance if you ask me. And while Dark Souls 2 does try to speed things up a little, taking one step forward with more fluid animations and movements, including an improved jump, it ended up taking 2 steps back in others, like the reduced number of movement directions, stubbier rolls, and much floatier feeling combat in general, with each move you make having what feels like a reduced impact to it. The intention to vastly improve the mechanics was there, but the execution was unfortunately more than a little off. Out of all the games to have received an overhaul to their mechanics, with Dark Souls 1 included, since that was of course iterated from Demon Souls, Dark Souls 3 is by far the most refined, both in its philosophy and its feel. Having just developed Bloodborne, which was a much faster game, From Software fused many of those ideas with those of the original Dark Souls to create a combat and movement system which was still rigid but not as tanky. They'd finally found a flow to it that was smooth enough to enable much more involved battles, while still chaining the player to the deliberate gameplay, with faster, cheaper rolling and better recovery in general being cornerstones of the game's approach which try their best reused to adapt the existing ideas into a format with far more potential. So, out of 5, Dark Souls 1 is getting a 2, as the most rigid, functionally apparent. Dark Souls 2 is also getting a 2, for performing worse in some cases, though better in others, and Dark Souls 3, as the most refined gameplay experience which has really stood the test of time, made especially evident by the fact that Elden Ring after it lifted a lot of its design, is getting a 5. Now, I will admit that how well you jive with the mechanics of each game is a pretty subjective thing. If you prefer a slower game where timing your attacks is far more important, as opposed to rolling for your life 16 times in a row, then you're definitely gonna disagree with me. And that's cool. But the balance of each entry is, I feel, a little more set in stone. These games have been out for a long time. We know what's good, we know why it's good, and we know how severely it messes with the integrity of the game. Whether it's making things too easy, or making certain pieces of equipment or styles of play obsolete. So, let's start with a game which leans very much towards the former, Dark Souls 1. You can be really, really strong in Dark Souls 1, like outrageously so, and it's not at all hard to pull off either, because so many builds are just so insanely powerful. Magic immediately comes to mind, with spamming soul arrows from a safe distance being a more than viable way to breeze through the whole game. Pyromancies are a close second, given that they have absolutely no stat requirements tied to them, and melee builds, well, every build, but melee gets the most use out of it, have poise, a stat tied to your armor which, if you have enough of it, gives you super armor against everything, without DPSing your enemies being the only requirement for winning every single battle, which, in heavy armor, was never very hard. Dark Souls 2 actually does well to scale the power of the player back a little, in some respects at least. Magic was still exceptional, with the new archetype hexes being by far the most useful, but other choices were clearly refined into more niche roles to avoid how easy Dark Souls 1 could get far too quickly, with two of the most accessible, quote-unquote, overpowered abilities, Pyromancy and Poise, being relegated to their own builds, with stat requirements and the implementation of weapon-reliant hyperarmor respectively, dragging them way back down to a choice to make like everything else, as opposed to something everyone has in their back pocket just because they can. And then Dark Souls 3 just decided to be weird. Like, the way this game is balanced makes you think that the developers wanted to go for a much more concise suite of equipment to use, like Bloodborne or Sekiro, but they felt forced to add in a huge number of items since that variety is partially what Dark Souls is known for. Magic here is so much weaker. It's a shadow of its former self. And dear God, don't even get me started on miracles. I swear one time I saw people gaslighting themselves into believing the reason they're complete shit is because of the lore. It's bad. Really bad. Which is a shame because the spells in this game look awesome, but so many of them are just completely useless. Dark Souls 3 is mostly for the swordsman. Strength has hyper armor, with it now being tied exclusively to its weapons, and Dexterity has attack speed with the bleed status effect to melt whatever it wants exceptionally quickly. Wizards got seriously shafted. So, out of 5 again, Dark Souls 1 is getting a 3, because while a huge amount of the equipment available may be viable, most of it either is, or borders on, overpowered, which skews the balance squarely against the difficulty of the game itself. Dark Souls 2's attempts to rectify the issues were actually largely successful this time, with more niches being introduced to combat how ubiquitous certain equipment was, so it's getting a 4. And for Dark Souls 3, I mean, come on, the variety in that game is a bit of a joke. It's getting a 2. Now, let's take a step back from the more practical aspects of each game to try and appreciate something a little more abstract. The visuals. Not just based on their objective qualities like the resolution or anything surface level like that, but also on the way they're utilised to contribute to an overall sense of consistent style. The direction of the art, if you will. I think it's fair to say that Dark Souls 1 has never been a looker in the traditional sense. All the geometry is very smoothed out with little to no complexity, and the characters often look like Play-Doh that was accidentally brought to life. But luckily, its visual style has a saving grace in the form of contrast. It's exceptionally harsh, which doesn't just help differentiate the various assets and areas in the game, but also contributes to its overall vibe of a foreign world in which you do not belong. Every other turn you take blasts the color palette with new filters and effects to contribute to the ambiance. And even though it's a simple idea, it's certainly an effective one, and pretty memorable at that. Though I think it's also fair to say that Dark Souls 2 manages to do it better. By integrating that colour and vibrance directly into the world itself as opposed to implementing it with post-production-esque effects, this game really pops in pretty much every environment you enter, without any of the unusual traditions that Dark Souls 1 employs to achieve its own style. And while it does mean that some of the dark fantasy disturbance is definitely lost, when it comes to creating a consistently pleasant game to gander at, which even gets a little cinematic at times, Dark Souls 2 does it very well, even if they still haven't quite figured out how to do the characters. Now, you might expect Dark Souls 3, similarly as it was with mechanics, to be a culmination of all the stylistic decisions that have been iterated on thus far, but instead it turned out to be something completely different. The level of detail here is undeniable, with by far the most depth and attention given to both individual assets and the world at large. But what can't be ignored, even with those merits, is the incredibly washed out colour palette that the entire game is set against. No matter where you are, you can always sense the lack of potential vibrance that the game could have. And while I do believe that this was done entirely on purpose to help immerse you in a dying world, it doesn't stop the latent potential of the visuals from making you feel like there could be a lot more going on a lot of the time. So, for the third time now, out of 5, Dark Souls 1 is getting a 3. Because while the much lower quality of the assets compared to the games following it may expose its age, the way that contrast is used, both with filters and special effects produced by things like fire, give it a well-defined style. Dark Souls 2 is next, and as the entry with the richest visual palette, it's getting a 4. The effects used don't make up for a lack of anything, they simply add to it. And as the most detailed entry with amazing potential that isn't entirely utilised, Dark Souls 3 is also getting a 3. Beautiful game, questionable style. And continuing in our discussion of things which are more creative than calculated, we have the story. The overarching narrative that sets both the precedent for your adventure and assists in its development as you continue to explore each entry. This is an aspect of game development that Dark Souls games famously take a minimalistic approach to, with contextual clues in the world you explore being their preferred method of storytelling. But I still think it's important to take a look at what's offered to us nonetheless. Dark Souls 1 is all about the beginning. The origin of Gwyn's undead curse, and the horror it brought upon the world during the very first cycle, with the lords who hailed directly from the first flame, and subsequently failed to recreate it, still being around for you to encounter during your journey. We're shown how the lords harnessed the power of the life they were given to do battle with the ancient dragons, and also how, in their reluctance to give their world up, they ruined everything as a result. Frampt, and most importantly Karth, are the only significant characters from this time who have direct correspondence with the player, and as a result, you have to figure most things out for yourself. Dark Souls 2 takes place in the middle of the timeline, with the first flame that fuels the integrity of the world having been rekindled countless times up to this point, and the focus is placed far more on how the undead curse has impacted not just Lordran, if it even exists anymore, but every kingdom in this world. We see how an agent of darkness in Nashandra manipulates a would-be hero in Vendrick into ruining his own reign by antagonizing the giants, which, coinciding with the curse's re-emergence, wrought doom and destruction yet again. What makes Dark Souls 2's story so unique is how much of it you're able to experience firsthand, allowing you to witness the siege on Drang Lake and interact with Vendrick directly at your whim. Nashandra is still around too, acting as both a guide and an adversary, and Aldia will actively seek you out to assess how much of a threat you are at various points during your adventure. The main story is incredibly interactive compared to the other games, though this does come at a cost that we'll be getting into a little later. If Dark Souls 1 marks the beginning of the curse, and Dark Souls 2 explores how its impact continues to ruin the world, then it only makes sense that Dark Souls 3 would be the one to end it. And that's exactly what this game is about. Ending things, breaking the cycle and destroying the curse for good. The opening, while incredibly cool, is pretty much a rehash of the second half of Dark Souls 1. Kill the bosses with powerful souls, so you can make it back to the Kiln of the First Flame to do battle with whatever the hell Gwyn looks like these days. And ultimately, aside from the drama of Lothric and Lorien being unwilling to sacrifice the former in the name of the Age of Fire, there isn't a whole lot going on. It's only when you make it to the latter parts of the game, including the endings, that things start getting interesting. The concept of embracing the darkness instead of rekindling the first flame isn't something that's really hidden from you anymore. There are plenty of ways to have an experience with it. Whether you happen upon Yol and Yuria, find the Firekeeper's Eyes, or, most prominently, do battle with Slave Knight Gale, creating a world devoid of flame is actively encouraged, especially since there are fewer NPCs to interact with who support the Age of Fire than ever, making its end something of an implied foregone conclusion. Now, when it comes to rating the story of each game, I want to emphasize that this is a category made distinct by its focus on overarching narrative, nothing else. So, with that said, once again, out of 5, Dark Souls 1 is getting a 3. The opening is the perfect hook you need to get into the world, but the context does most of everything else. Dark Souls 2, with its much more involved narrative, which takes place a little more presently to keep you engaged, is getting a 4. And Dark Souls 3, which mirrors the first game, only the ending replaces the beginning as the point of interest, is getting a 3 as well. Right, now, let's move on to a category which, while running in parallel to the story, constitutes, quite rightly, a much larger amount of each game's acclaim: the world. Because Dark Souls entries don't just place you into their dark fantasy and expect you to assimilate immediately without objection, they immerse you in it first. Until, before you even realise what's happened, you start asking and seeking answers to its questions all by yourself. And as the game which really cemented From Software's ability to coalesce each element of their contextual world building to create something truly captivating, Dark Souls 1 deserves, without a doubt, the highest praise. The world is desolate, a husk of what you can only guess it once was. Faint connections which initially make little to no sense litter every area you explore. Items and enemies are placed in suspiciously relevant places, and people you know you can't trust appear in progressively dire situations as you try to help them break through the overarching ambiance of sheer depression that, as you dig deeper and deeper into Lordran, becomes clearly inescapable. But it's not just the hopeless isolation that comes with trying to overcome a land which feels indomitable that acts as the game's signature. It's also the smaller details, like the scraps of lore you can grasp from each item you find, the bells of awakening ringing out in another player's stead, and especially the dedication to maintaining the illusion of geographical accuracy that, combined with the game's level design, makes your personal progression in Dark Souls' adventure feel so palpable. It's foreign, it's uncanny, you're never sure of exactly what's going on, but despite that, it's wide open for you to unravel. The world of Dark Souls 1 is, fittingly, one of a kind. With standards like that, it's not at all fair to expect the same of Dark Souls 2. And while I wish I could say its world is at the very least comparable to that of the original, unfortunately it's not. Primarily because dark fantasy, while still technically the theme, often takes a backseat to a more standardized rendition of the trope, which tends to ruin the consistency of the world you're exploring. Forgettable NPCs with dull designs aside from a few outliers are regularly introduced, locales which look like they'd be better suited to a children's fairy tale show up regularly, and a lot of the lore makes reference to people and organizations so generic sounding and or irrelevant to the rest of the world that you'd be forgiven for thinking it was a D&D Dungeon Master's first attempt at writing a campaign. And that's not to mention the half-baked attempt that was made to give Dark Souls 2's world the same sense of scale that Dark Souls 1's had. It clearly just wasn't designed for it, and the wildly disproportionate distances between locations end up looking quite silly. The only praise I can really give to Dark Souls 2's world, and this is kind of a stretch because it's disregarding the world as a collective concept, is the way it contextualizes certain individual areas, like Shulva the Sanctum City and Aldia's Keep. It honestly isn't particularly bad at telling self-contained stories whatsoever, and unraveling them just as you would in Dark Souls 1, only on a smaller scale, is still fun. But it's missing that cohesion between all of those stories throughout the world to elevate it any further, which is a concept that Dark Souls 3 actually manages to take directly from the gauntlets of Dark Souls 2 and run all the way to the Kiln of the First Flame with. Because despite being structured in an incredibly similar way, at least as far as the more independent level design is concerned, Dark Souls 3 manages to be much better at connecting the dots, and therefore fleshing out its world as a whole. The feeling of desolation throughout the world is back, but it's not quite how it used to be. If Dark Souls 1's world immerses you in the husk of a fallen kingdom, then Dark Souls 3's does so in one that's been left to erode for so long that it's been reduced to mere dust. Almost nothing is alive in this game, and as a result, you're left to fight whatever remains. Corpses that have been reanimated thousands of times, watchdogs and machines devoid of thought, operating exclusively on instinct and what purpose they have remaining to exist, rulers, demons, their might and ambition have also fallen to the sands of time, and it's clear, above all else, that this world, having defied its mortality in vain for eons, needs to end. Towns and churches are rotting in disrepair. The NPCs aren't blind to their fates anymore like the ones of ages past, wishing for their deaths instead of harbouring hope for the future. And one of the most significant links in the game to Dark Souls 1, Anor Londo, which used to be a city draped in gold and splendour, well, it died a long time ago, with its frigid body still standing, though infested with the very same corpses that have bled into every other corner of the land. This world isn't just dead, it decomposed. I could go on forever about how well Dark Souls 1 and 3 are connected, not just internally, but with each other. But that would take a really long time, and we'd probably all end up dead too. So let's get to the point and give each game a score. Dark Souls 1 is getting a 5. This world, along with its challenging reputation, is what made the game famous. It gave people something to bite into beyond the surface level shock of the game being hard, and it created a community so massive that it eventually eclipsed those that were more interested in the exciting but fast-burning gimmick of just talking about difficulty. Death, depression, context, and coherence, it nailed pretty much everything, and laid a huge amount of the groundwork for the sequels to draw on in the future. Groundwork that Dark Souls 2 barely used, and is getting a 2 for as a result. While the main game does have a few references to what came before it, and some of the new stories it tells are okay, the game just feels so far removed from the precedent that Dark Souls 1 set that it's hard to ignore. Any attempt at an overarching theme was seemingly abandoned in favour of trying to throw out as many ideas as possible in the hopes that some of them might work. And some of them do, but that's not how you create a consistent world which will immerse the player. Dark Souls 3, on the other hand, took so much inspiration from Dark Souls 1 that it's actually a pretty common point of criticism, since it does, admittedly, take a lot of elements from that game's world and just kill them more. But I personally don't have an issue with it. They're trying to convey, in incredibly simplified terms, that things were bad, and now they are worse. The areas, characters, and enemies are all consistent with that fact, and while it's not doing anything Dark Souls 1 wasn't, it's highly derivative, the way it furthers the desolation of the original game in a progressively natural feeling way makes its world worthy of a solid 4 in my book. But in a video game, designing areas with a rich history behind them is only half the battle. They also need to draw upon their individual qualities to provide a uniquely functional experience for the player that shifts and changes throughout the adventure to keep them engaged throughout. In Dark Souls games, level design goes hand in hand with the world as one of the series' most iconic features, and the parallels, as we shall see, run rather quite deep. just as each facet of Dark Souls 1's world building coalesced, so too did the level design with it. The entire game feels like an intricate labyrinth of connections and pathways that continually reveal their significance as you progress, contributing once again to the overall sense of scale and coherence within the world. A factor that also makes some of the most outlandish locales relative to the medieval theming, like the Demon Ruins, integrate into Lordran far more smoothly than you'd expect. Though it is well known that this concept of using interconnected design to mask contrast does eventually lose its luster, with later areas like the Tomb of the Giants and Lost Izalith foregoing this idea entirely to instead tack themselves on to existing areas in a far more linear fashion. And strangely enough, despite this decision being a well understood result of deadlines, Dark Souls 2 actually opts for an incredibly similar approach, with a world ripe for exploring available to begin with, before the scope of your progression is narrowed down to a more linear quest nearing the end. Though in Dark Souls 2's case, it does definitely feel much more intentional, and the later areas are both better designed and more memorable for it. The issue with Dark Souls 2's level design is that it misses the mark in the area that was most fundamental to Dark Souls 1's reputation, the interconnected progression. The game isn't bad at making you think that it's going for the same approach, at least initially, but after spending some time with it, you come to realize that it's way more linear overall than its predecessor ever was. Sure, you're free to choose which direction you head in, but each one of those is pretty much a straight line to the item you need to continue, made up of areas that have been very loosely spliced together based on tangential relations and nothing else. There's very little backtracking or discovering new routes to be done. I mean, you might open a shortcut here or unlock a door there, but they'll almost certainly only have relevance in the area you found them in, not across the traversable world as a whole. And once you've completed those 4 mostly linear paths, then it's time to begin the part of the game which is supposed to be linear, which makes the entire experience, again, feel like a straight shot to the end. There is, however, a silver lining to all this, because the heightened focus on individual areas as opposed to the world as a whole made it possible for completely disconnected areas to exist which embrace that fact and flourish because of it, like Broom Tower and Ilium Lois, which bring the concise, interconnected design of Dark Souls 1's entire experience to the local level to make those few standout locations feel more complex. A design philosophy which actually ended up being the foundation that Dark Souls 3's levels were built upon for the most part. It's clear at this point that any sparks that were left in that bottled lightning of interconnected world design had completely burnt out during Dark Souls 3's development, and pressing forward with an approach akin to Dark Souls 2's DLC areas, where the complexity existed but on a disconnected level, was favoured. This means far less choice in how you progress, far more linear levels, and a game that plays almost identically every time, even more so than Dark Souls 2, save for a couple of branching paths like choosing between the Profaned Capital or Anor Londo. And while this does make it an experience that feels distant from the original game in a lot of ways, the masterful design work that went into most of these areas can't be ignored. If Dark Souls 1's world is a sprawling labyrinth, then Dark Souls 3's is a web of them, spliced together with the utmost care to preserve immersion as much as possible, despite its ideas being so closely related to the black sheep it takes the most inspiration from. Including Lothric Castle and its Grand Archives, the Cathedral of the Deep, and Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, just to name a few, there's a huge amount of density packed into these individual locations, despite them being the constituents of a wider world. And while the level design of that world as a whole may suffer for it, the experience you are afforded, while different from its predecessors, is more than worth it regardless. And the fact that it's designed in such a linear way is masked so well that most players would be hard-pressed to even care. When you take a closer look at it, the way that the level design in Dark Souls progressed between entries was incredibly simple. Dark Souls 1 had a complex world with less defined individual areas until you made it to the halfway point. Dark Souls 2 tried to do the same thing, but kinda dropped the ball on the complex world part, leading to From Software creating richer but more disconnected spaces for its DLCs. Then Dark Souls 3 took that idea and meshed it with some deliberate design decisions to somehow make the world feel as cohesive as Dark Souls 1's, resulting in the linear but dense feeling campaign we have today. So, for each of their contributions to the level design of the series, Dark Souls 1 is getting a 4. It started the concise, interconnected world craze while simultaneously killing it off, because not even From Software themselves could replicate whatever black magic they'd harnessed to create that world, even in the second half of the game itself. As a game which tries to recapture what made that design great, fails, and then quickly starts throwing together all of the constituents of the world that was going to exist with some serious standouts here and there, Dark Souls 2 is getting a 3. And as the entry which gambled on dedicating itself almost entirely to linear design, being both unique and often more intricately designed for it, Dark Souls 3 is also getting a 4. Now, before we make our way to the end of this journey and discuss the signature boss battles which make up so much of the Dark Souls series' identity, we need to take a quick detour to touch on a more subdued but essential aspect of each game: the systems. Stats, upgrades, souls, numbers, things you interact with within the game beyond its standard mechanics that allow you to delve deeper into the experience. And while this does mostly come in the form of how you enhance your gear, there are a few other noteworthy facets to give this topic a little more substance. In Dark Souls 1, the game systems are generally a lot more involved than the sequels, requiring a reasonable amount of time and experimentation to understand. There's various forms of Titanites, multiple blacksmiths with different functions, all at different ends of the earth, and understanding how to make the most of the merchants available to you is something that just kind of has to click if it hasn't been explained to you already. Because purchases in this game, especially for mages, often constitute incredibly substantial, borderline necessary upgrades to continue developing your repertoire, with taking advantage of these items for sale in place of leveling up being the most common approach, which is a fun way to scale your power beyond just upping your stats while remaining monetarily dependent all the same. Its overall style is honestly pretty retro, even compared to Demon Souls before it, and I mean this in the nicest way possible. The prerequisite of knowing exactly who to go to for certain services and having to trade a slowly cultivated small fortune for important purchases makes obtaining those upgrades all the more satisfying without being so complex that it becomes bothersome. A style which is, unfortunately, as we'll see, quickly lost over time. Dark Souls 2 simplifies things, like way simplifies things. One blacksmith can do everything you need. The most important NPCs, aside from that very blacksmith ironically, usually move to Majula pretty quickly and stay there, and coloured titanite is gone in favour of various stones which allow you to infuse your weapons in a much more straightforward manner, without severely limiting how many resources you can acquire to take certain upgrade paths during a playthrough. Which is something that Dark Souls 1, with its myriad of material types carried over as a remnant from Demon Souls, did definitely have a problem with. It's honestly hard to criticize Dark Souls 2's approach, because it's putting function first and drawing a clear line between how much trying to interact with internal systems should intertwine with your gameplay, which in this case is not much at all. You don't need to make any specific journeys to meet with specific people for the most part, except for Ornifex and Strayed, who are perpetually next to a horde of enemies for some reason. They're usually all just there and ready to talk to, which is really helpful, but it completely loses the charm that I personally enjoyed of, for example, seeking out Blacksmith Vamos, or making a divine weapon for the first time with Andre and having absolutely no idea what I was doing. Dark Souls 3, quite rightly, stuck with this style of having every NPC you need in a communal space with a singular blacksmith as the centerpiece. And while I wish I could say, great, no notes, not my preference, but that's absolutely fine, the game, for some bizarre reason, decided to add an extra prerequisite to access infusions this time around, called coals. They're basically key items scattered throughout the world that allow you to perform new types of infusion every time you hand one over to Andre, but I personally find it really hard to see the point. Gems, the replacement for stones, already exist, and your ability to infuse weapons is definitively limited by whether you have one of those in your inventory already. So restricting dark, bleed, hollow, lightning, simple, and chaos infusions, all to a point that's pretty late in the game in this way, is kind of arbitrary, and completely removes the fun there could be of trying to obtain a late game gem early on to get an exclusive upgrade. I'll admit, it's a pretty specific point to hone in on, but it's a decision I've never understood. I'm also not a massive fan of how watered down shops are in Dark Souls 3. Prices for equipment and spells are like half of what they used to be, so you never really have to save your souls for very long, and making a big purchase that should feel like a huge upgrade just doesn't have the same ring to it that it did in Dark Souls 1. The systems aren't always necessarily the most interesting or dynamic aspect of each game, but they do all get the job done of making your numbers go up in just the right way relative to what you put in. And for a facet of each game that should ideally be out of the way for the most part, they all serve their purpose sufficiently. But as far as scores are concerned, which are definitely a little more difficult to designate in such an innately functional category, Dark Souls 1 is getting a 4. It can be pretty confusing at first, and coloured titanite was not a great idea in hindsight, but aside from that, I think that the scope of the world you're exploring usually justifies splitting up a lot of the services you use throughout it. And come to think of it, the lack of a more cohesive world is probably why, in addition to accessibility, Dark Souls 2 and 3 opted for much more practical approaches with their hub areas in an effort to avoid complicating anything when so many of the locations in those games are singular in purpose and likely won't be returned to. So, to its credit, Dark Souls 2 can also have a 4 for setting the new standard, and Dark Souls 3 can have a 3 for streamlining things even further, but also introducing Cole for a reason that is completely beyond me. It's just as well, really, that we've had the chance to utilise the systems within each game to refine our gear and expand our repertoire, because for our final category, it's time to take on, standing side by side with the world they exist within, the other most iconic feature of Dark Souls and its sequels, the bosses. Warriors, knights, demons, and beasts, which cap off each area you explore, with overwhelming tests of adaptation and execution that force you to develop as a player before you can break through the barrier they've created and earn the right to continue your adventure. And while they were honestly pretty terrifying at a time where most people were completely new to Souls-like gameplay, Dark Souls 1's bosses, for the most part, have not aged particularly well. A lot of the early game encounters are either just far too easy or rely on a gimmick like the Capra Demon's dogs to be any sort of threat. And these issues never really improve as you progress. From the midpoint where the Iron Golem who guards Anor Londo is a complete pushover, to the endgame where Nito relies on mobs, and the Bed of Chaos is such a blatant inconvenience that the developers allowed you to save progress on it between attempts, the format may be remembered fondly, but when you break it down, the substance in each battle is often quite lacking. These guys just aren't advanced enough to adapt to different playstyles like modern bosses can, and it really shows. It's a big part of the reason that magic is considered such a cop-out in Dark Souls 1, because rushing down a player who's spamming projectiles is one of the things their AI tends to struggle with the most. Don't get me wrong, none of them, except the Bed of Chaos, are terrible or anything. I still think pretty much every boss in the game, up to and including Orenstein and Smo, is permanently emblazoned into my memory, and the DLC bosses like Artorias and Calamite all do a much better job at forcing you to be more proactive in your approach, but fond memories and a few standouts don't do much for the roster as a whole. Dark Souls 2's bosses also have these problems. They're actually even worse for it, to the point that it's actively lambasted for its quantity over quality approach that sees each individual encounter having even less depth to it than those of its predecessor to squeeze more fights into the game overall. Some bosses are so menial in fact that there's a good chance you'll run them over on your first attempt without even trying. Prowling Magus, Covetous Demon, the Dragon Riders, and so many more. It's telling of just how plain these jobbers are that this is a criticism I'm much more hesitant to levy over Dark Souls 1 bosses, aside from the encounter with Pinwheel, because even though many of the challenges in that game may have been rooted in the circumstances you faced your opponent in, as opposed to the power of the boss itself, you still had to learn what they're capable of to stand a fighting chance most of the time, which is a baseline standard that these duds from Dark Souls 2 can't even meet. But in its brazen desire to outdo Dark Souls 1's quantity of battles, it did, perhaps accidentally, end up producing a more than respectable number of genuinely thrilling boss fights, which have to be given a nod. And unlike the best areas of Dark Souls 2, these aren't even all exclusive to the DLCs. The Smelter Demon, Looking Glass Knight, Dark Lurker, and Ruined Sentinels are all excellent examples of the nuance that the game can bring to the table when it's trying. And luckily for us, a more laxed development process during the production of the DLC content allowed that fleeting quality to be captured and bottled more definitively. With Sir Alon, Sin the Slumbering Dragon, the Burnt Ivory King, and of course Rain the Fume Knight being some of the best battles in not just this game, but across the entire series. There's only a few misses in this additional roster, vastly outshining that of the base game, and they enhance the experience as a whole to such a significant degree that it, at least for me, often makes slogging through a lot of Dark Souls 2's generic schlock to get there worth it. Now, up to this point, I think it's fair to say we've been digging through a pile of relative mediocrity or outright failures to highlight the few that stand far above the rest. And I have to tell you, this trend is ending right now, because the standard of quality for Dark Souls 3's bosses completely blows the other two games out of the water, in terms of difficulty, spectacle, their ability to adapt, and their sense of individuality. There are very few bosses in this game that don't do at least one of those things so right, to the point that the other factors become complementary. High Lord Walnir is way too easy, but the atmosphere is unmatched. Champion Gundyr is a half-reused boss, but he's recontextualized into an endgame powerhouse. Even the Deacons of the Deep, widely regarded as one of the worst bosses in the game, can cast a curse spell that is so damn ominous, you end up breaking under the pressure of anticipating trying to dodge it. Every single boss here brings at least something I can appreciate to the table. But as the majority, it's only right that the bosses which are absolutely amazing without any of those caveats attached are given the spotlight. There are, of course, far too many contenders in this category to list them all here, but I think if I were to choose just a few bosses which best represent what I enjoy about their inclusion in Dark Souls 3, they would be Udex Gundyr as a direct evolution of the same challenge that the Asylum Demon created in the original game, Pontiff Sullivan, representative of all the relentless duels you have to endure throughout your journey, and the Demon Prince, as one of the most complex battles in the entire game, executed with such exceptional finesse that it acts as a testament to how far From Software has come since Dark Souls 1. Progressive, relentless, and complex. They're three pillars that are rarely lost throughout your time clashing blades with the bosses in Lothric, and as qualities present as consistently as they are, especially compared to the other two games, Dark Souls 3's bosses are, by far, the best the series has to offer. So, for the last time before we conclude upon our winner that shall reign upon the series forevermore, it's time to score each entry. As a game that's world and level design evidently held up far better than its bosses as the iconic feature with the most longevity, Dark Souls 1 is getting a 2. I love this game, and it pains me to say it, but most of these bosses do not hold up. In an ironic twist, most of Dark Souls 2's bosses were never trying to hold up in the first place, instead being filler to make the game seem more impressive than it really was. But as we noted, this approach resulted in just a few too many excellent encounters for it to be a coincidence. And with the DLC bosses bolstering it further, it's getting a 3. But let's be real, there was never any question about which game was going to top this category. The consistent quality alone secures its higher score, but everything beyond that, from the complexity of the combat to the cinematographic potential often realized, pushes it further beyond. Dark Souls 3 is getting a 5. And now, at the end of it all, through analysis, deliberation, and a whole hell of a lot of personal bias, it's time to announce the final ranking. For those of you who've been keeping score, you already know how weird this is gonna look, but for the rest who've been saving themselves for the reveal, here we go. In last place, with 26 out of a potential 40 points, we have Dark Souls 2. A predictable outcome, sure, though not one which necessarily seemed guaranteed given how influential its ideas ended up being. Also in last place, which technically now makes it second place, with 26 out of a potential 40 points, we have Dark Souls 1, which is certainly a little more surprising given its reputation, leaving only our winner with 29 out of a potential 40 points as Dark Souls 3. It's an excellent game and just as worthy as any other of leading the pack. So, there you have it, open and shut, case closed, you got your answer, and there it shall stand until the end of time. Is what I would say if I genuinely believed this was a viable way of definitively ranking a game series, or if I even believed that drawing an arbitrarily formatted conclusion based on such a linear analysis is something with much of any merit, because I really don't think it is. No, the point of this video was, first of all, to have a bit of fun and talk about some of my favourite games ever, but more prominently to take the time necessary to highlight precisely what makes each of these experiences exceptional in their own way, and appreciate how their ideas, both good and bad, transformed over time to further define the following entries. Ironically enough, the scoring system actually contributed to this. I mean, the difference between the quote-unquote best and worst game constitutes quite literally 3 points, practically nothing. The fact of the matter is, each entry in the Dark Souls series is so endearingly imperfect that it props the other two games surrounding it up, and resultantly, makes them all worth playing for their own qualities, with the degree to which you appreciate their individual nuances largely dictating your personal preference. Dark Souls 1 is retro and fundamental, with a viscerally classic dark fantasy setting and exceptional level design throughout the world. Dark Souls 2 is highly experimental, and took so many risks that it ended up embodying the result of each one, giving it some of the highest highs and the lowest lows. And Dark Souls 3, with the experience accrued over years of Souls-like development, embraced a much clearer vision from beginning to end, which resulted in a far more refined final product that had the strong foundational ideas it needed to build beautiful set pieces and incredible battles on top of it. So, between three of the most influential, iconic, and downright brilliant games of all time, feel free to take your pick, because it's clear, now more than ever, that there's a hell of a lot to love in every single one. And thus concludes what I expect to be by far my longest video for a while. I'm honestly really surprised it turned out this way. I'm always trying to remind myself to be concise when it comes to writing, but when you're talking about something you absolutely love, I guess it's pretty easy to get carried away. And if I'm gonna get carried away talking about anything, then I'm glad it was Dark Souls, because this series is amazing and more than worth the time. Anyway, I've kept you for long enough. Thank you so much for checking this video out. If you have anything you'd like to comment, I'd love to hear about it. But from me, that's all for now. This has been Rain Reaver. Thanks for watching.